So, building on our previous discussion of the interplay between activity, habit, and free will, we now turn our focus to a tool that seems essential for navigating the world: logic. Think of it as the rule book for the mind's quest for truth. But what exactly is this rule book? It's the science dedicated to figuring out the rules our minds should follow to actually land on the truth. Now you might be thinking, isn't this just psychology? Well, not quite. While both are deeply interested in the workings of the human mind, they have different jobs. Psychology is like a comprehensive biography of the self, covering everything from emotions to consciousness. Logic, though, is more like a specialized guidebook, focusing only on one chapter: intelligence, specifically how to use it effectively to reach true conclusions. Psychology wants to understand the mind as it is. Logic wants to help us use the mind to become better at finding truth. One describes, the other prescribes. Now, while we've drawn a line between them, these two fields, logic and psychology, are definitely not living in separate worlds. They're actually quite chummy, relying on each other in interesting ways. First off, they both fundamentally care about what makes us human, the nature of our minds. But here's the kicker: you can't really decide how to use something until you know what it is. So, before we can figure out the best logical strategies, we need psychology to tell us what intelligence actually entails. It's like needing to know the engine specs before designing a car's performance system. Second, intelligence doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's constantly teaming up with other parts of us. Think about how your willpower influences your decisions, or how your feelings color your perceptions. In complex scenarios like religious belief, will and sensibility are huge players. So again, psychology gives us the background on these interactions, which logic then tries to harness. However, there's a twist. Logic also feeds back into psychology. Why? Because logic deals with certainty, that feeling of knowing something is true. And certainty is the bedrock of any scientific endeavor. If psychology wants to build a solid science of the mind, it needs to grapple with how certainty works, which brings us right back to logic. It's a fascinating loop. Okay, so we've established logic is important. But some folks, maybe even some of you, might raise an eyebrow and say, hold on, don't we already have natural logic? Isn't reasoning just baked into us? Do we really need to study syllogisms and formal rules? Does this stuff actually fix broken thinking or push science forward? Fair question. Let's tackle this head on. First, let's remember that not all science has to be immediately useful in the real world. Think about pure mathematics or geometry. Would you say Euclid's geometry is useless because you can't build a house with just geometric proofs? Of course not. It exists as a beautiful, self-contained system that satisfies our deep-seated need to understand patterns and structures. Logic is similar. Even if mastering it didn't directly improve your job skills, understanding the underlying principles of correct reasoning is intellectually valuable. It fulfills that innate human drive to make sense of things. But okay, let's say you're still unconvinced about the pure science angle. What about practical use? Here the argument gets stronger. Yes, we might have a gut feeling for good reasoning, but guess what? We mess up. Our instincts can lead us astray just as easily as they lead us towards truth. Think about optical illusions, cognitive biases, or just plain bad arguments we've bought into. The best shield against these errors is to actively study how truth works, how error works, and under what conditions each arises. Knowing the enemy is half the battle. Now someone might counter, but wait, sometimes logic seems to lead us down rabbit holes. True, sometimes we misuse logic or apply it rigidly where intuition is needed. But does that mean we should ditch the whole toolkit? Imagine saying, we sometimes drive cars poorly, so let's get rid of cars. No, we learn to drive better. Similarly, acknowledging that logic can be misused doesn't mean we abandon it. The number of times we've erred by not using enough logic vastly outweighs the times we've erred by using too much. Don't let a few bad apples spoil the barrel. So, if we accept its importance, how do we characterize logic itself? It turns out it has a fascinating dual personality. On one hand, it's a science. Like physics or biology, it aims to explain something, in this case, the phenomenon of reasoning itself. It asks, what is reasoning? And tries to uncover its laws and principles. But on the other hand, it's also an art. And art implies a goal and a method for achieving it. Logic's practical goal is to help us achieve truth. So it's not just describing how we reason, but prescribing how we should reason to get it right. This makes it different from pure psychology, which, as we said, is content just to describe mental states without necessarily aiming for a practical outcome. Where does logic fit in the broader landscape of philosophy? Interestingly, it shares this dual nature with ethics. Ethics, too, is both a science trying to understand moral principles and an art guiding us on how to live virtuously. Logic and ethics are the cool kids who are both scientists and artists, while psychology is the dedicated scientist, and maybe other branches of philosophy are more like dedicated artists. Given this dual nature, we can break down logic into two main chunks. First, there's general or formal logic. This part is like the theoretical physicist studying the fundamental laws of physics. It focuses purely on the abstract rules and structures that govern valid reasoning. It doesn't worry about whether those rules are being applied correctly in a specific context, like analyzing a scientific experiment or a legal case. Its sole interest is in understanding the mechanics of thought itself. What processes does the mind actually use when it successfully arrives at truth? Think of it as reverse engineering the engine of reason. The second part is applied or special logic, which we often call methodology. This is where the rubber meets the road. It takes the general rules identified by formal logic and figures out how to combine them, adapt them, and apply them to specific domains of knowledge. How do you use deductive reasoning in mathematics? How do you use inductive reasoning in scientific inquiry? How do you structure arguments in law or ethics? Methodology answers these questions. It's the practical application of the theoretical insights from formal logic to navigate the messy business of discovering truth in different fields. Alright, let's zoom in on a core concept, certainty. What does it mean to be certain? The text gives us a neat definition. Truth is the conformity of the mind in things. Basically, when our mental representation accurately matches reality, we possess truth. Certainty, then, is the feeling or state of knowing that we possess this truth. It's the subjective experience of truth impacting our consciousness. Think of it as the mental confirmation light turning green. And naturally, the opposite of certainty isn't just ignorance, which is the absence of knowledge, but doubt, that nagging feeling that we don't actually know if something is true. So the big philosophical question pops up: what causes this feeling of certainty? The obvious answer seems to be truth itself. When truth is present, certainty follows. But this immediately leads to another crucial question. If truth causes certainty, there must be some kind of signal, some indicator, some sign that allows us to recognize the presence of truth. What is this sign? This is what philosophers call the criterion of truth, the real trigger for our feeling of certainty. So what is this magical criterion, this signpost pointing to truth? Many philosophers, historically and today, point towards evidence. The idea is that truth presents itself objectively, like a flashing neon sign that clearly distinguishes itself from falsehood. Think Descartes, who talked about a light intrinsic to truth that illuminates the mind. Now, sometimes people attribute this idea of objective evidence directly to Descartes. But the text suggests he meant something slightly different, more about the will directing attention towards truth. The real champion of this objective evidence idea, according to the text, is Spinoza, with his famous phrase verum index sui, truth is the index of itself. It suggests truth inherently reveals itself. But here's the snag. If evidence were truly objective and unmistakable, wouldn't everyone agree on the same things? If there was a clear external signpost for truth, wouldn't all rational minds point to the same destination? Yet, look around. People fiercely disagree on countless important issues: politics, religion, ethics, even scientific interpretations. There are no universally agreed upon answers to many of life's biggest questions. This diversity of opinion throws a wrench into the idea of an objective, foolproof sign of truth. If such a sign existed, wouldn't we all be converging on the same conclusions? Okay, so the idea of a single objective sign of truth seems shaky because of all the disagreement. Maybe, someone might suggest, there is an objective criterion, but some people just aren't seeing it, or aren't interpreting it correctly. Like there's a universal map, but some people are looking at the wrong section, or reading it upside down. That could explain some differences, sure. But does it explain the really deep, fundamental disagreements, where people hold completely opposite views, and are equally convinced they're right? It feels like it's not just a matter of misreading the same sign. It's often like people are pointing at entirely different signs, or even different landscapes altogether. If everyone had access to the same objective evidence, wouldn't we expect more convergence, not less? Since the objective evidence theory struggles to account for this pervasive disagreement, the text suggests we need to take a different tack. Let's ditch the idea of a single universal sign and look closer at the different kinds of certainty we actually experience. So if we ditch the idea of one universal sign, what do we find instead? Well, when we look at the judgments people make, we notice a pattern. Some statements seem to be universally accepted, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. Others are hotly contested. Is free will real? Does God exist? These contested ones appear true to some people and false to others. This simple observation tells us there can't be just one kind of certainty. There must be at least two. But the text argues there are actually three distinct flavors of certainty we encounter. First, there's mathematical certainty. This is the rock-solid feeling you get when you've followed a proof, like knowing Pythagoras' theorem holds true. Second, there's physical certainty. This is the immediate, intuitive feeling you get when you perceive something directly. I see a tree, I feel warm. It's strong, though perhaps less rigorous than mathematical certainty. Third, and perhaps most relevant to everyday life, is moral certainty. This is the feeling of conviction we have about things that aren't provable by math or directly observable, like believing your friend is trustworthy, or holding a political belief, or having faith in a religion. You feel deeply certain, even if you can't provide airtight logical or empirical proof. These three represent fundamentally different ways we arrive at and feel certainty. Let's dig into the first type, mathematical certainty. This is the gold standard, the feeling you get when you've constructed a watertight argument, like proving a geometric theorem. What's special about it? Two key things. First, you can usually explain why you're certain. You can lay out the steps, show the connections, and anyone else who understands the premises and rules will agree. It's communicable and verifiable. Second, it's universally recognized. If you prove something mathematically, everyone who accepts the axioms and rules of deduction will accept the conclusion. So, how does this certainty arise? The text points to deductive reasoning. Think of it as a chain of identities. If A implies B and B implies C, each step logically follows from the previous one. When you know the angles of a triangle add up to two right angles, it's because you've established an identity between the properties of those angles and the properties of angles around a straight line. The proposition you're considering becomes identical in meaning to another proposition you already know is true. Therefore, the cause of mathematical certainty is this identity, this logical equivalence. The criterion, the sign that triggers this certainty, is the discovery of this identity within the structure of reasoning. Next up, physical certainty. This is the feeling you get when you directly perceive something. You look out the window and see a bird flying by. You're immediately, intuitively certain that you see a bird. This certainty feels very real, very direct, even if it's perhaps less logically rigorous than a mathematical proof. Like mathematical certainty, the basic fact of perception is generally agreed upon by everyone experiencing it. Everyone agrees that the perception occurred. This perceived fact carries an authority that seems to impose itself on the mind, making you feel certain. Now, a classic objection here is hallucinations. People sometimes see things that aren't there, ghosts, monsters, etc. Doesn't this show physical certainty can be misleading? The text offers a clever rebuttal. The mistake in a hallucination isn't in the perception itself. The person is certainly perceiving something, an image, a sensation. The error lies in the judgment they make beyond the perception. They affirm the existence of a ghost as based on the perception, but the perception itself doesn't guarantee the ghost's existence. The physical certainty is in the act of seeing, not necessarily in the interpretation of what is seen. So, the cause of physical certainty is simply the occurrence of the fact itself. The perception imposes its authority on the mind. Now for the third type, and perhaps the most psychologically interesting one, moral certainty. This is the feeling of being absolutely sure about something, even when you can't back it up with mathematical proofs or direct observations. Think about an architect designing a massive bridge. They might feel incredibly certain that the design will hold, even if they can't physically test every component or provide a perfect mathematical model for every stress point. Or consider religious faith. Someone might feel utterly convinced of their beliefs, transcending any empirical or logical demonstration. This is moral certainty. It's characterized by that deep, unwavering conviction, even in the face of acknowledged uncertainty or lack of proof. Unlike mathematical or physical certainty, judgments based on moral certainty are rarely universally accepted. What feels like solid ground to one person might seem like shaky ground, or even outright falsehood to another. This type of certainty is incredibly common in our daily lives, governing most of our beliefs and actions about things that fall outside the strict domains of pure math or direct fact. So, if moral certainty isn't based on objective evidence like the other two types, what causes it? And why do we feel so strongly about these convictions, even when we can't prove them rigorously? The text argues that we need to bring in non-logical psychological factors. Remember how intelligence often works alongside will and sensibility? Here, those other faculties take center stage. Our sensibility, shaped by our temperament, upbringing, habits, even our genes, tends to have a vague affinity for one side of a dispute over the other. It's like having an innate leaning. This sensibility then provokes the will. The will, acting on this leaning, directs our attention, focusing our mental eye on certain aspects of an issue and deflecting it from others. It's like tilting the lens. Finally, the understanding, operating on this limited biased view, jumps to a conclusion and affirms it with certainty. Notice the crucial difference. With moral certainty, it's not the judgment that convinces the mind, it's the mind, influenced by sensibility and will, that imposes a judgment onto the situation. This makes moral certainty inherently personal. It's tied to our unique blend of passions, habits, and temperament. Since everyone's sensibility and will are different, it's no surprise that opinions vary so widely. We cling to our moral certainties so fiercely because they are deeply intertwined with our personal identity and emotional investment. So, what are the big takeaways from this analysis of certainty? First, moral certainty is the default mode for most of our thinking. Because most of our judgments involve interpretation, value judgments, or beliefs about complex social or metaphysical matters, they rarely meet the strict criteria of mathematical or physical certainty. This explains why we feel so often and so strongly about things we can't fully prove. Does this mean we should all become skeptics and doubt everything? Not necessarily. The absence of an objective, foolproof sign for truth doesn't mean truth is impossible to find. It just means it's harder, requiring more effort and critical engagement. The text suggests that our personal biases, our sensibility and will can obscure truth from us. But crucially, these biases aren't insurmountable obstacles. Through discussion, debate, and exposure to different perspectives, we can gradually peel away the subjective layers and reveal the more objective, shared elements of an argument. As discussions become freer and more inclusive, the impersonal, objective core of truth tends to emerge more clearly. This leads to a vital conclusion: tolerance. Since truth isn't always self-evident, and our initial convictions are often colored by personal factors, we shouldn't expect to find it exclusively among those who think exactly like us. Recognizing the subjective roots of moral certainty should foster greater understanding and tolerance for differing viewpoints. Okay, we've talked about how we get certainty. But what about false certainty, error? That's when we feel just as certain as ever, but we're completely wrong. The text defines error simply as false certainty, certainty that lacks a foundation in reality. Now, how do we get errors? One influential idea associated with Spinoza is that error is just partial truth. The argument goes like this: we often focus on one aspect of a complex reality and mistakenly believe that's the whole story. For example, looking at a man in isolation, we might think he's independent and free, forgetting his connection to society. Spinoza called this seeing only a part of the truth. But is this the whole story of error? The text challenges this. Consider the example given, explaining why water rises to 10 meters in a vacuum by saying nature abhors a vacuum. This isn't about seeing too little. It's about adding something extra, attributing a sentiment to nature that it doesn't possess, going beyond the actual facts. This seems like a different kind of error, not just a partial view. Furthermore, even if Spinoza's partial truth idea were correct, it doesn't fully explain how we make the leap from seeing a part to mistaking it for the whole. It describes the result, but not the mechanism. To avoid errors, we need to understand their cause. So, where do errors actually come from? The text distinguishes between our intuitive and discursive faculties. Intuition, like direct perception, is supposedly infallible. Hallucinations aren't errors of intuition itself, but errors of judgment made based on a perception. The real action happens in the discursive faculties, analysis and synthesis. Analysis is breaking down ideas, deducing one from another, where the first is contained within the second. Synthesis is putting ideas together, adding something new that wasn't there before. Think of 2 plus 2 equals 4 as analysis. Metals conduct heat as synthesis. The argument is that errors can't happen in analysis. If you wrongly conclude A equals B, it's because you incorrectly assumed B was contained within A. The error lies in the synthetic step of adding B to A. Therefore, the theory proposed is that every error is fundamentally an error of false synthesis. Sometimes the synthesis falls short of reality, diminutive error. Sometimes it goes beyond it, augmentative error. And what causes these false syntheses? Surprise! It's our old friends, sensibility and will. They intervene, influencing the understanding, causing it to distort the truth, either by leaving things out or adding things that aren't there. This connects back to moral certainty. Only moral certainty, which involves these subjective faculties, can be deceptive. Mathematical and physical certainty are supposedly infallible. So, from the inside, error and moral certainty might feel similar, a strong conviction. The only difference is whether that conviction aligns with reality or not. Now let's talk about skepticism. We've defined certainty and doubt. Dogmatism is the view that certainty is the normal state, and our faculties are generally reliable. Skepticism flips this, arguing that doubt is the normal state, and we should be deeply suspicious of our own faculties and conclusions. Between these extremes lies probabilism, the idea that we can have degrees of belief, holding opinions that are probable but not certain. The text quickly dismisses probabilism. Why? Because probability itself relies on a comparison. Saying X is more probable than Y implies you have some basis for judging likelihood, which requires some form of certainty, or at least a framework for assessing it. If absolute certainty is impossible, probability loses its grounding. Conversely, if certainty is achievable, why settle for mere probability? So probabilism seems philosophically unstable. What about skepticism itself? The skeptics typically rely on three main arguments. First, human ignorance. We don't know everything perfectly, so how can we trust our knowledge? The counter? Admitting ignorance about much doesn't negate the certainty we do have about some things. Second, errors and contradictions. Look how much disagreement there is. How can truth be accessible? The counter? We've already seen that contradictions often stem from sensibility and will, not the understanding itself, and discussion can help overcome this. Third, reason's incapacity to prove itself. The classic circularity problem. Reason can prove everything else, but how do we prove reason is valid? The counter? Skepticism itself uses reason. Plus, the inability to self-prove doesn't automatically justify doubting all conclusions drawn by reason, especially since the reasons for distrusting reason aren't compelling. So after examining skepticism, the text concludes that absolute skepticism, like absolute dogmatism, is ultimately illogical. Both start from an unproven premise. Dogmatism assumes reason is reliable, skepticism assumes it isn't. We need something more nuanced. What's needed is a doctrine of criticism. This approach doesn't start by blindly accepting or rejecting reason. Instead, it critically examines our faculties, our senses, our intellect, our emotions, to determine when and how they can be trusted. It investigates the reasons for both belief and doubt, and makes decisions based on this careful scrutiny. It aims to identify the domains where each faculty is most reliable, and specify the conditions under which they can be safely used. Essentially, criticism is a systematic, self-reflective examination of the mind itself, aiming for a balanced and well-founded approach to knowledge. That brings us to the end of this exploration of logic's foundations.